I'm Maxwell McCormack, Jr. I'm a forest scientist, earned a degree in forestry at the University of Maine in 1956. I've worked in the Pacific Northwest, in the Southern Pine, down south, and I was at Southern Illinois University and then the University of Vermont before I came here, and I retired from the University of Maine in 1997. My title was Research Professor of Forest Resources. I came to Maine in 1948 and got off the train in Franklin to go to a summer camp. And it was in that summer of 1948, we went into Mac Noy's Christmas tree lot of improved trees. At that time, I decided I wanted to pursue a career that might have me end up in Maine and working with the forest. Dr. William Adams, who was chair of the forestry department, small group of guys at the University of Vermont, received a McIntyre Stennis funding package. And Bill Adams had promised the Vermont and New Hampshire growers, has always been the New Hampshire-Vermont Christmas Tree Association, that he would get a research program going to help them grow spruce and fir Christmas trees. And by July, I had moved to Vermont. I went at it with all guns blazing, and I'm still sitting here since 1964 talking about Christmas tree production. Back then, we had some connection with the extension people all at Cornell, New York. There was a businessman, textile business by the name of Asplin that had property up in the Adirondack area. And he had a workforce from his textile factory that had an off-season. And he had this big piece of land where he was raising sheep. And he decided he might as well grow Christmas trees. So it ended up a bunch of textile workers with sheep shears. And then he made his own seed collections and planted. So you had a strong effort coming out of Cornell. In 1964, the annual every 2 years convention of the National Christmas Tree Growers Group was over at Cornell. A lot of the leadership were successful rural people, nurserymen who had moved up from Connecticut and southern New England, retired school teachers, biology teachers across New Hampshire. And then you had the grower group developing. The growers in Maine, where you had forestry faculty with some extension time that supported the group, and you had an extension forester. The extension foresters were key right across the 4 states. You had Alex Dixon in New York, you had Ray Foles in Vermont, a fine gentleman by the name of Lou Bissell in Maine, who were ramrods. And it was while I was a student here at the University of Maine, in the year about 55, 56, Henry Plummer, the professor, knew of my interest in Christmas trees, and in Franklin kept me informed that the Maine Association actually originated at that point. But that was by 1955, 56. They were a solid group and had their founding meeting in the Scudic Grange Hall in Franklin. So you had all this going on, and I got tossed right in the middle of it all. We moved toward the seed orchard. But this was after we dealt with weed control, and the shaping, and all of that came as part of this package. But looking at what we had, the focus narrowed down to balsam fir. And the natural population of balsam fir is made to order for geneticists. There's a tremendous variation from east to west, with changes that occur from the high elevation in the mountains in the Maritimes. Several of our best sources, I'm not sure, come from Newfoundland. But it's very, very similar, and you can see it in the chemistry of some of these documents I have, to the high elevations across the high elevations in New Hampshire, and I collected some of the best stuff was from the ridge line on Mount Mansfield and Campbell's Home. The thing is, if you're going to get the basic genetic improvement, you need variation within your population. And balsam fir is loaded with variation that offered opportunities to select. I saw that right away at Vermont. I went there in '64. By '65, I can show you pictures of out in a plantation where I'm looking at what's going on, a plantation in northern New Hampshire, and I tracked it down. I did some investigative work, and the trees came from Newfoundland. Brown Company had a nursery in Newfoundland. And in '67 and '68, I started making some selections, and I have photos of those trees, and they are a key part of this program. This is a year's growth. Look at the internodal branches and look at the whorl. And you say, well, that's 1 year. Well, I broke this out of the tree in '69, November '69, because there'd been some trespassing and people were stealing trees. And this one stuck out like a sore thumb, and I wanted to make it look ugly. So for a couple of times at that stage of growth, I broke the top out and I kept part of it. So you can see what I was looking for. And the tree itself was an absolutely gorgeous tree. I have photos of it that I've taken more recently when it's about 45, 50 feet tall. But we found several, and I found, I didn't find it. John Young said, I got a tree I want to show you that I've got an article that was in Vermont Life, and there's a nice color photo of his guys harvesting trees in '65 or '66. And back up, you see this tree standing there. And this was a tree that a year or so later, John took me up and we looked at. And I have pictures of him, photos of him standing by that tree, and I think it's a relative to this one. And when they fill out like those two trees did, and John and I together riding a back road in northern Vermont back in those same late '60s, we were going down around a curve. And I get down past the curve and I kind of looked at John, and John looked at me and he says, did you notice that balsam fir tree? And I said, yeah, but I wanted to take another look because I can't believe it was a balsam fir tree. He says, let's go back. And we went back and we looked at it. And we looked at it and we climbed in. It was pretty tall. And I've got a good shot of him standing with it. And we went through and we looked up to that tree. We couldn't see a whorl in it. We could not pick out a whorl. And he says, we got to look at this. So I tracked it down, found out who owned it. And I said, hey, we'd like to climb your tree. And I told him what it was. He says, sure. Dwayne Bailey, little guy, little wiry guy. And I said, Dwayne, you think you could climb that tree up there by Echo Lake? And I showed him the tree, and he said, yeah, for when the cones ripen. So what he would do is go out at night in Burlington and find these nice homes with these dense, big blue spruce trees. And I don't know if he had permission or not, but he practiced. He climbed them. So we got a lot of seed. We raised a lot of trees, and we selected from within those, but we also have that tree. I have a second generation tree from, you saw the photo there with Riley Bostwick. Riley was a World War I veteran who returned to his rural home in Vermont, having been pretty heavily gassed and was disabled and given a few years to live. It happened he knew Calvin Coolidge, and better than that, he knew Mrs. Coolidge quite well. And he had a tree on his land that was a pretty nice tree that he had picked out way back. And he went to the Coolidges and said, we ought to have a national tree. to go on the ellipse in front of the White House. So with Mrs. Coolidge working on Calvin, they decided they'd do it. Riley found a tree over in the Middlebury Forest that would work, and he actually picked and sent down the first tree. And when he came back to his farm after that event with Coolidge in the White House, there was a tree that was, I've written it down, in 10 feet or so in the woods that he thought looked good. So he protected it and picked it. And when he sold his land to the federal government, it's now part of the Green Mountain National Forest, he did so with the understanding that he could continue to visit and take care of that tree, and that we could cut it. We in general cut it if we wanted to. I was there when they cut it, and it became the national tree on the ellipse in 1967. And when they cut it, and they had a huge crane, and it was hanging, and it was, I've got the photos of the tree. Joe Trombley, one of the leaders in the New Hampshire-Vermont Association, stopped the whole operation. And he looked at me and he said, I forget, 3 minutes, I have it written down. You got 3 minutes to get in that crown, and we're still some cones holding together, and collect what you want, and then get out of the way. And I'm holding my bags with those cones, showing, Riley came over and he says, let me see what you've got. And that's me in the snow. It was a blizzard going in November, holding a bunch of the broken cones with the seeds, and all for Riley to come over and see them. And I put them in a bag, and that tree's in there. Now, that was a bit of a forced entry, but my vision was the progeny from that tree could be marketed as pageant of peace progeny. But nobody ever, I tried. But it's still in the seed orchard. So we have seed orchard in 2 sites, and I tried to place them accordingly. You're not looking to have them self. You want to get, cross a nice Newfoundland tree with that tree I found in northern Vermont, and that sort of thing. I made the maps to place the trees as best I could, and we established the 2 sites, one provided by Dwight Newman in Norwich Walk, the other by Ed Chase. It's not really in Ashland, it's in, and the name escapes me right now, but it's not an organized town. But anyhow, we did that, and we got 2 locations, and my technician who had worked with me at Vermont came over and worked as my technician for the first many years that I was here in Maine. He knew what was going on in the whole thing. He did the grafting. The idea was to set up a sufficient number of seed-yielding trees to provide seed for the stock that would more than supply planting stock for the Maine growers. So they could develop I don't think they ever went far enough with the merchandising on this, and they're there. But it's hard to get a bunch of volunteers and other people to do the work necessary to maintain, to care for the trees, to fertilize them, to prune them, to take the tops out of them so they don't get too tall, and do everything possible with them. And then I also, based on what we've learned over the years, went in and I selected trees that we could do without and marked them to be thinned out. Nobody had to do anything with them, just cut them. But I don't think it ever got done. There just wasn't the interest in the commitment, and a lot was taken for granted. And my point here is we had a long time of looking for trees, and it wasn't just selecting a tree you liked. That didn't work, because when I got into this Christmas tree business, and I spent a lot of time just going out with growers and spending time with them in their own operations, and they'd always ask, well, what kind of a tree do you have in your home? Well, when I started the project, and I was living in Vermont, I'd have as many as 3 trees. One year, I think I had 4 trees. My son had a tree in his room. My daughter had a tree in her room. We had a tree. And I tried white pine. I tried Scotch pine. dried white spruce. And I'd have to tell those guys, it doesn't really matter what I like, because I'm one tree. And you've got to stay flexible for the market. A legacy, I went into forestry, and I stuck with it. As I was finishing high school, if I even had a wild dream that I could have a career like I've been able to have, and the friends and colleagues and family, and I have a wife who is more than I could ever hope for. I've a couple of things. This just appreciation, I have an honorary life membership, Maine Christmas Tree Association. I also have an honorary lifetime membership with New Hampshire, Vermont. I never dreamt I'd ever have that kind of a recognition. I've seen people have come and said, boy, I'm glad I listened to you. Richard Downey came to me one time and he says, I learned. I mean, Richard Downey is probably the greatest grower of balsam fir Christmas trees who has ever lived. And I think even Jim LaCase would have owned up to that. It's a special thing, and I really hesitate. When I was at Vermont, I was an advisor to a fraternity house, and some of the guys said, most of us don't know anything about forestry, it's just the forestry majors, and there's no course or anything. Why doesn't the department have some kind of a forestry elective that those of us on campus could take and find out a little more about what forestry's about? So I took that idea to a department meeting one morning, and they said, well, that's probably a good idea. If you could come up with 20 students or so to take a first run at it, we'll put it on the books as an elective for a year. I went back to them, the guys, and I said, I've got to have 20 or more people. We offered it up the next semester, and I had, 24, 25, more than half of which were guys from the fraternity house. And they said, geez, you ought to offer it again. So we offered it for the next year, and I had something like, I don't remember, 35, 50. And went on to the semester before, I've left out another very important component. But anyhow, the students learned that I had gotten a sabbatical to go to Germany for a little over a year. And they said, geez, we're not going to be able to get your course. And so they pressed, and the university said, university was making money on it. And they said, can you offer 2 lecture sections? I met a night, 3 hours in a night for the class, 3-credit class. And they said, can you offer 2 sections? And I said, yeah, but I'm there. It's going to be a different lecture that week. I can't do the same lecture twice. It was a real burnout thing. So we offered it, and that semester I had 778 elected the course. So high point, now I get going. I guess too many high points. I could. Great surprise in 2016, I received the Austin Wilkins Award. My name is right, follows Irving. I was the 13th recipient. The preceding one in 2015 is Irving Woodlands. And it ends with this sentence, for the most significant contribution of leading the vibrant recovery of over 1 million acres of Maine spruce fir forests after the cataclysmic 1975 to 85 spruce budworm epidemic.
Good for you. That's high praise.
I was kind of shocked. And And I left out in the Christmas tree part the single biggest thing is this right here. Yeah. In about 1970 or so, I got a note. Two German guys, young men, wanted to stop by my office in Vermont. And they came in and they wondered if I could take a day or two and show them some Christmas tree operations. So and in the middle of all this, they say, our professor wanted us to deliver these papers to you, that if you will fill them out, he will have you as a guest professor and you will be funded by the German government. So I went to Germany for 14 months to study their Christmas tree industry. Well, there was another catch in that, is I had to give my seminars at the three faculties of forestry in what was then still West Germany. I had to give my seminars in German. It wasn't good German, of course. And the guys said they could understand, but that I had a hell of an American accent. A selfish high point, because I was able to spend 14 months. I put 25,000 miles on a VW camper for my family. So these were some of the high points. Selfish, I realize this. Yeah, I've had a great time. I didn't expect to live quite this long, and up until recently, I've been able to, I don't know what more I can say.